Good afternoon, everyone. This is not the National Press Club, and I am not about to introduce Donald Trump. My name is Adam Posen. I'm president of the Peterson Institute for International Economics, where we are. And we are excited and frankly honored to be having, in a sense, the valedictory speech in the U.S. of Marco Buti, the Director General for Economic and Financial Affairs at the European Commission. Marco will be discussing economic policy in the rough, a European journey. I say valedictory for two reasons. Marco is, despite the best efforts of the Commission to not create a new commission, is coming to the end of his repeatedly extended term as Director General of ECFIN. He's been in that role since December 2008. And in other words, obviously, throughout the entire European crisis, the brief window of hope that many of us took for major European progress institutionally and the subsequent muddling through that I guess we all should have expected. Neither the crisis nor the muddling through were due to Marco, but the recovery of Europe and the stabilization, Marco was a key contributor. We have a world, as many of you know, in which long-term civil servants, particularly in the US and now apparently in the UK, are not being valued, and the top roles in government are being reserved for political appointees. This is obviously just one more symptom of a world in which expertise is undervalued, partisanship is overvalued. In Europe, for all the complaints about a European bureaucracy, I and many of my colleagues will join me in saying it has been a bastion of both stability and of incremental but sustained progress, that there are such experts in DG ECFIN, in some of the other directorates general at the Commission, and such leading public servants as Marco Buti. It's been my personal pleasure and the Institute's privilege to work recurrently with ECFIN, with the delegation of the European Union here in Washington, including our friend Moreno Bertoldi, but in particular with Marco on various forms of research through the years. Marco and the Commission have challenged us to be useful to them as one of the few places in the US that has enough distance to be critical and ambitious for Europe, but enough knowledge to not be just ridiculously lecturing. And I'd like to think we've met that challenge. But this is less about what we've been able to contribute in the relationship and more about what Marco has been able to contribute. And a few of you have heard me say about people like Stan Fisher or Mike Froman or others I genuinely admire about their performance in a succession of public sector roles. And I view Marco Buti in much the same category, someone who's intellectually honest, who goes beyond integrity to a strong sense of duty, who engages in public and in private, who wants to do more than he's allowed to do, but recognizes reality and advances what he can, and who ultimately, and those of you who've served in various governments, not just US, know how rare but how useful this is, wants to do the right thing in policy, wants to figure out what's the right thing to do and then try to do it. And especially today, we should not take that for granted. Another small point that Marco may end up discussing a bit today, as he reminds me, is that he's one of the few, if not the only person, who's actually been there for every G20 meeting since the G20 was created, and therefore was present at the creation. I had a small kibitzing role as well for Gordon Brown when we actually did some useful things in the first few meetings of the G20. And since, of course, it has not quite lived up to its early days, but it still remains a premier forum for thoughtful international cooperation. And again, Marco is there trying to make that happen. Director General Buti will shortly be moving on to a new role at the Commission after now near 11 years leading the incredibly important group at ECFIN, and we are honored to have him reflect on his European journey and Europe's journey today. Marco.
Thank you very much, Adam. Actually, I'm extremely happy and a bit moved also to have this opportunity here. And as Adam indicated, Peterson has been a point of reference for us intellectually, analytically, for policy, sound policy advice, actually for a long time, even before becoming Peterson. I mean, with reports on Euro 5, Euro 10, and the latest work also on what we can learn in Euro from the currency unification of the US. I think actually with contributions by people in the room, Adam himself, Jacob, and others. And you remain our points of reference in the future. And actually this cooperation between Peterson and Peterson Fellows and the Commission and the European economists will continue. Actually, we are going to have this week, I look at Olivier Blanchard is going to be a keynote speaker at our annual research conference in Brussels. So, I mean, this is not only in general, but also in particular, very important. I mean, in reflecting and preparing my remarks, I thought maybe one could start with a quote of some sort, just to summarize my experience. So, economic policy in the rough. And a natural one that came to me is Ridley Scott. You know, I have seen things that you people wouldn't believe. But I thought one could adjust it, and that's what I have done. So my version of Ridley Scott is the following. I have seen things you economists wouldn't believe. Political attack ships on fire off the shoulders of the Parthenon. Have watched Euro beams glitter in the dark of Eurogroup nights. All those moments should not be lost in time as concluding statements in the rain. Time to complete the Eurozone and change the policy mix. So I have given you the sense of the journey and also actually my conclusions, which are precisely that it is high time to complete EMU and change the policy mix. That will be my very last slide. So what I have done today is actually out of this 11 years, I've picked up a few moments of the Ridley Scott type, which I think are relevant for, at least personally relevant to interpret the policy predicaments today and in the future. Some are very well known. They are extended moments. Take Greece, for instance. Others less prominent, but nonetheless, I think, relevant. So I picked 5 of them. The prequel of the crisis, the Baltics and Latvia, then G20, Deauville, Draghi speech, Jackson Hole, Greece. That was what I would like to do. Just a snapshot and then draw some lessons from each one of them and then try to put things together. Now, the first one is the Baltics. Now, obviously, the crisis, the sovereign debt crisis, what is being remembered. So, Eurozone countries have been under stress. But there was a prequel of the crisis, which was Eastern Europe and the Baltics in particular. And I have singled out here Latvia because it's the country which underwent a program, IMF EU program, and which was, I think, quintessential of the crisis. So strong performance of the Baltic Tigers in the mid-2000s, I mean, fueled by capital moving downhill and pouring into the countries, credit expansion, housing bubbles, which came to reckoning at a certain point towards the end of 2008, which led to capital flow reversal and the need to for these countries to enact very drastic adjustment programs, either on their own or, in the case of Latvia, with the help of the EU and the IMF. They had different policy trajectories. I think, to be fair, I think Estonia of the three Baltics was the one with sounder fundamentals. I think also stronger institutions, higher quality of the political class. I think Lithuania was in between, and Latvia the most affected. There you can see that in November 2008 applied for a program. Then there was, I think, a sharp fall in GDP. Actually, you can look at the right-hand scale, which is different from the left one, where it's the euro area growth, and you see sharp fall in growth in output actually during this period. What are the lessons that one can draw from this? These are some of them. One is that financial crisis, even in small countries, can have very pervasive effects and high potential for contagion. I think I remember discussions at the time with the IMF, and this element of contagion was not fully embodied in their reasoning. I think a lot has been done, has changed since then, but I remember vividly a conference call. At the time, it was conference calls day and night. So I mean, that was one from a meeting of the Economic and Financial Committee in Luxembourg, and we had a call on Latvia, so what to do, and we raised the issue of contagion. So so how would we deal with that? And the answer of the IMF at the time, they said there is no problem. There is no problem. We give a program to all the countries involved. This was not precisely what one would want to do for stemming contagion, and clearly pushed back on the degree of acceptance of going there. Second is sustained capital inflows. I think embellish the fiscal accounts, and the fiscal accounts go into reverse, but often, and it has been the cases in other countries also of the Eurozone, the bad fiscal accounts are often the effects, not the prime origin of the crisis. I think what we did not learn immediately is that, in a sense, the Baltic story was relevant also for the Eurozone. Actually, these countries, they had either currency boards on very fixed exchange rates, so the fixing the banks, moving to banking union, I think should have been something which could have informed the management of the crisis of the Eurozone. It was not really the case in the first place. Fourth, the exchange rate regime is more than a monetary arrangement. And I think it's an important element politically. We had at the time quite a lot of discussions on whether to change the exchange rate regime or not. And we did a lot of analysis, balance sheet effects, competitiveness implications, and we did economic analysis, econometric simulations, and all sorts of analysis. And the case, one could have made the case for changing the exchange rate regime or not. And I remember what we did at the time. We worked for Commissioner Almunia, that he was the commissioner in charge. So what we did as ECFIN, as Adam said, being analytically minded and serious people, we went there with all our analysis quantified with our Quest model. We have done very serious analysis on pros and cons on changing the exchange rate regime. So we went to the commissioner, stone face, he listened to us very silently, and at the end, after our exposition of the pros and cons, he told us, "You have understood nothing. I do not want to have a mid-sized Russian oligarch to buy the country." That's what is the end of the story on changing the exchange rate regime and devaluing brutally the exchange rate of Latvia in that particular case. So from that viewpoint, I mean, it's more than a monetary arrangement. This geopolitical element, I think, is very, very present. And fortunately, you have a good combination of technocrats with people with a political mind, which is important. Then, related to this, not so much nominal adjustment, but deep structural reforms are key for sustained growth and stability. I think that was what in a painful way, the Baltics had to do at the time. First episode, first moment. Second one, Deauville. This is better known. Franco-German compromise between Sarkozy and Merkel was in October 2010, very much catered for domestic audiences. So basically, they met in Deauville, Normandy. It was actually in a meeting with Russian President Medvedev at the time. But the discussion was on how to tackle the Eurozone crisis. And they came up with a compromise in which the French averted an automatic enforcement of the Stability Pact rules with sanctions. So they say, we make rules stricter, but we do not apply it in a mechanic way, but gave in on the so-called PSI at the time, so private sector involvement, which is a nice way to say we bailing creditors. And the results in the markets are what I put here as showing the 10-year spreads to the German Bund. Be careful here because the y-axis squashed all the other countries but Greece, because there was very sizable impact also on France, on obviously Italy and the other countries, Spain, Ireland, Portugal, but at a certain moment also countries like Austria or Spain actually had the uptick in the spreads. To be fair, in the literature you have analysts, Ashoka Modi is one of them, who do not agree with the mainstream view on Deauville, and he traces back, especially for Ireland, from other countries, some underlying factors. But I think the general opinion, that would be my own, is that Deauville, as Adam Tooze put in his book, is a Lehman, they say, the Lehman moment for Europe. There was no prior consultation of Euro area partners, US, ECB. Actually, we were all in Luxembourg at meeting of the Eurogroup, where we were discussing a report by Herman Van Rompuy, the then president of the European Council, on how to reform surveillance and coordination. And the news came like a thunder in the meeting, and everybody was completely taken by surprise by the announcement, and with actually furious reactions by some of the, at least one of the two members countries there involved in the deal, because this was considered to be very dangerous. I mean, and Jean-Claude Trichet also, erupted in a pretty, let's say, graphic way at the time. So this was Deauville, and in particular, what affected the markets was the fact that in future programs, a precondition would be the bail-in of private creditors, so the restructuring of the debt. So that was clearly very much tainted the reactions of the market. So the lessons from this, First of all, I mean, financial markets do not operate gradually. They operate along, horizontal and vertical lines. So from benign neglect to, extreme reactions. And I have to say, thinking that one could rely safely on markets to discipline the countries, I think is a daring proposition. Second point is that risk reduction measures, if they are not coupled with risk sharing measures, actually they increase risk, they do not reduce risks. This was an example there, and I mentioned it here also in previous occasions. Those who are pure risk reducers, they are actually the worst enemies of themselves. Because what happens is that the risk of Armageddon in financial markets actually triggers more bailout, not less bailout. So I think you need to have, and this is very relevant discussion now in the context of EDIS, Deposit Guarantee, Banking Union, etc. So the parallel move on both risk sharing and risk reduction. EU level, to the extent possible, should be insulated from domestic political economy considerations. Extremely difficult to do, but an effort has to be made on this. I think everything then processed through the lens of moral hazard actually do not lead to sound policies, in particular in periods of stress, and not coordinating with partners like the ECB, or for what matters also across the Atlantic can be very dangerous. Here, what Tim Geithner is in his book on Deauville, if you are going to restructure Greece, you have to have the ability to, in effect, protect or guarantee the rest of Europe from ensuing contagion. Let me open and close immediately a bracket. I think a pretty scary counterfactual exercise would be to rerun the euro area crisis, not with Tim Geithner or Lael Brainerd on this side, but with somebody else, a bit less, let's say, multilaterally oriented. And I think one would really see things that people would not want to see. So this, it was a bracket that I closed immediately. Now, third is Toronto. This is less well known. This is one of the many G20 meetings and summits. It comes after important decisions, for instance, in London or Washington, 2008, at the beginning of the crisis. London, I remember the tripling of the IMF resources, so important. Toronto came in June 2010, and most of the participants were ready to declare victory. It looked as if the recovery was on the way, so we could withdraw the fiscal stimulus and reduce the deficits. So you see there 2010 G20 Toronto, and then the commitment was at the time that by 2013 deficit would be halved, should be halved, and that later stabilized. And actually, if you look at, I put the vertical lines there in the graph, and you can see actually both the US and Europe pretty much went there. With the difference is that for between 2010 and 2013, growth was about 2.25 in average in the US, and in Europe it was the period of the double dip. With taking the whole period, it was about 0.5 point growth overall. So it was clearly too early to withdraw the fiscal stimulus. So ex post, one can see that pretty clearly. From the G20 Toronto declaration was, one could see that a difficult, I remember the negotiations of the drafting of the statement, a difficult compromise between synchronized fiscal adjustment, which one could see as potentially problematic because of the synchronized impact on demand, and at the same time the risk of failure to implement consolidation, which would undermine confidence and hamper growth, this difficult compromise actually was too much tilted into the consideration of sustainability and not consideration of stabilization. So I think the lessons here are also pretty clear. First of all, the spirit of London, coordinated response, was largely gone. So we were more in trying to bring together in difficult compromises those more hawkish on the fiscal side and those more dovish, rather than undertaking a cooperative strategy in a very coordinated way. I will also given you my appreciation on the early withdrawal. I think need to better weight risks and costs of the trade-off between sustainability and stabilization. I think there was not much accent on the quality of the adjustment, I think, which has become an important element since then. And at the time, a lot of comfort on the standstill on trade protection, but actually the measures hampering trade actually continue to grow over time, and protectionism started to creep in. Obviously, it came to the fore later in a more effective, in a more explicit way, but already one could see there the difficulty in agreeing on the standstill. Then we had the Greece. So this is a very big story, so I'm just taking a clear, very short snapshot on the experience. I think where we started, you can see here. So we started basically with the announcements of the government of a deficit about, put here, 3.5% in April, and revised then at the end of the year, and then ex post over 15%. So this was a huge shock, which prompted the basically shutdown of the markets. And the need to intervene with, for the first time, with because for Latvia we had in the EU budget we had a dedicated instrument, the balance of payment support, but for the Eurozone we had nothing. So we had to intervene and patch up things, and in a very creative way. The first was and done that in an intergovernmental fashion, not with the typical community method. The first one was the Greek loan facility. Then the EFSF, and then the ESM, together with the fund. Overall, between the fund and the EU was support in terms of loans of about 290 billion over these years. Brexit speculation in July 2015, where I think we went 1 inch before the possible exit of Greece, and then quite surprisingly, if one looks a bit in a historical perspective, the conclusion of the program in August 2018, the exiting there, and with a performance which, with all difficulties, I think promises to be, reasonably sound. A lot was done to help Greece at the time. One could question, I think, and rightly so, Olivier has done it in his previous capacity. I think at the beginning of the program, probably excessive austerity. At the same time, in the classic criticisms, the acknowledgement that had Greece not been, had the EU ESM IMF program not been there, I think it would have been considerably harsher for Greece, having lost market access. And ESM estimates is that the budgetary savings from the programs actually amount to about 6.5% of GDP. If you look at the implicit interest rate now, is actually for Greece lower than in Spain, Italy, and Portugal, due to the very long extension of maturities and very low interest rates. Now, lessons from this, I think the first one is the fiscal crisis, which was, very much coming to the fore with the cheating on the accounts, actually affected the narrative of the crisis interpretation in Europe. So we looked at the other countries also through fiscal lenses, which I think was essentially a mistake. So I think had Ireland come to the fore, I think before Greece, maybe you could have had a different story, and I would be here probably telling you a different take on this. Second point is that the crisis is also structural nature. It's again fiscal, yes, and fiscal both are cause and symptom, but also structural nature. And I have to say here, we need to have a proper ex post assessment, because the classic IMF programs, 3 years nominal internal devaluation, I think is not enough for dealing with cases like Greece. I mean, we arrived in Athens with infamous or infamous troika, went to the ministry, asked how many employees the minister has, just normal question. The answer was that we don't know. So, I mean, just as an example of the deep-rooted structural problems that we faced, that sustainability need to be assessed in a timely but also sui generis manner. Here, there was clearly, in the discussion with ministers, it was impossible politically to envisage a cut in the principle. So, in their support, so public sector, so official OSI, official support, could not be relieved by a cut in the principal. So we did that. An imperfect substitute was lower interest rate and lengthening of maturities, which in present value terms is not all that different, but in terms of political perception was very different indeed. So I think that was so an innovation, and the focus was more on gross financing needs rather than on the stock of debt. So I mean, this. So in terms of sustainability, I think that helped a lot. At the time, and here going back to July, August 2015, when the Brexit debate flared at the political level, I think the commitment to the single currency as it was, and to the integrity of the single currency was underestimated by the markets. And here I have to pay tribute, I have to say, to Jean-Claude Juncker as president of the Commission, because, and we had a farewell lunch just a couple of days ago. He was recalling that at the time he got many calls from leaders throughout the Eurozone telling him, stay out of the Greek crisis. This is a matter for governments. It's not for you. It's not for the Commission. And actually he put the foot down, and if Greece is today still a member of the Eurozone, and the Eurozone has preserved this integrity, I think owes a lot to the fact that he said Greece will not exit the Eurozone. So it was a bit like what I mentioned before about Commissioner Almunia, so a political decision which, very, very important ramification for someone who, as president of the Eurogroup for many years, I mean, could understand also the markets and the political implications as well as the financial ones. The Commission paid a political price in dealing with Greece, actually a heavy one, because the perception of the Commission being an agent of the creditors sticking on in the public opinion. I think we did. It was a typical case in which we were criticized actually on both sides of the spectrum, being unpopular in Athens, being pretty unpopular actually also in Berlin and other capitals. For on the one hand, for being agent of austerity, on the other hand, for being far too lenient. What we try to do all this long moment was actually to try to identify the fundamental well-being of Europe and the general interests. Whether we have succeeded fully, obviously, is up to it's for discussion. But I think that was the polar star that we tried to follow. Draghi at Jackson Hole. This was August 2014. You could see that. I think maybe Adam, you were there when Draghi he gave the lunch speech at Jackson Hole. So, and it was the first time that European central bankers actually called for a more balanced policy mix. Okay? So he was explicit on you cannot leave monetary policy alone. Fiscal policy has to do its part, as well as the structural reforms. He emphasized the risk of hysteresis and being too cautious with monetary policy and underusing fiscal policy, too little long-term economic and political cohesion of the Eurozone. So he gave a very important speech, and you can see that was followed by important decision on conventional and unconventional policy. Now we don't call them like that anymore because everything has become conventional, given the toolbox has expanded notably. A lot of them from the central bankers, but you can see the decisions taken on the balance sheet on the interest rates. The lessons here. Monetary policy cannot be left alone. More balanced policy mix required. I think what was not fully understood at the time, Draghi was not explicit, has been much more explicit afterwards, including in the latest speeches, is that trying to achieve the euro area fiscal stance via coordination of national fiscal policy is exceedingly difficult. So the point here, and that's what we have been trying to argue, is that you would need to have a central fiscal capacity actually complementing the national budgetary policies to get to a proper fiscal stance for the Eurozone. Third point is that excessive fiscal prudence may also become a form of fiscal dominance. And here you remember 1981 Sargent and Wallace Unpleasant Arithmetics, where fiscal policy was seen as the dominant factors eventually affecting the behavior of monetary policy via threat of debt monetization, and the whole Maastricht construction we actually tried to cover for that. And here we are in a sense on Sargent and Wallace on their head, because if you give a mandate to the central bank in periods of hitting the effective lower bound, and you do not have actually fiscal policy coming also to support, then there's excessive prudence on that front is a form of fiscal dominance affecting monetary policy and pushing against the wall of their mandate. And finally, I think more generally, a certain amount of risk sharing is needed in EMU. Either it takes place by a national budget in a more explicit adult way, or it comes a bit by stealth via the ECB balance sheet. And I think that's what we have seen. Hopefully now we are ready to deal with that in a more explicit way. I put two quotes here from Draghi, Jackson Hole. The risk of doing too little outweighs those of doing too much. And Maynard Keynes in the open letter to FDR, so Franklin Delano Roosevelt, back in December 1933. I do not blame Mr. Ikes, so the Minister of the Interior in charge of the New Deal, for being too cautious, being cautious and careful. But the risk of less speed must be weighed against those of more haste. It must get across the crevices before it is dark. I take a little pride, I have to say, on this, because I shared with Mario Draghi before Jackson Hole the speech of Maynard Keynes, the open letter of Maynard Keynes. Not saying that affected his reflections. I'm sure he confirmed him in his intuition, but hopefully in my remote dreams may have had an impact also on his thinking. So these were the The 5 episodes, so key lessons for the future of EMU, what we need to do. Banking union, I think fiscal stabilization capacity, acknowledging the geopolitical relevance of EMU, and tackling the issue of democratic accountability. How did the 5 episodes contributed? I don't want to go through this. You'll read yourself or look at the slides afterwards. So Deauville very much impacting on banking union, Baltic crisis also for what I have been indicated. So the underpinning the rationale for banking union important. Deauville also the geopolitical relevance. You know, we put the whole world in trouble at the time by not very considerate decisions. G20 in Toronto, I think, on underpinning the use of fiscal policy. Jackson Hole also in Greece, you know, impacting several of these. This is what basically what we need to do in terms of the agenda for banking union, fiscal union, economic and monetary union in general. So I hope this would be lay the framework, the coordinates for the initiatives of the new college and the new commission. We have a new incumbent also in Frankfurt, Christine Lagarde, who has been pretty explicit on several of these elements here in her previous life at the fund. So hopefully we have a, let's say, a conjunction of, let's say, intellectual alignment which would push in this direction here. So this is on EMU, and my final slide is actually, as I mentioned in my quote at the beginning, is time to change the policy mix also right here, right now. So on monetary policy, this is Mario Draghi Sintra speech. Monetary policy having to be patient, repeated shocks, so you have to be patient and remain expansionary for a long time. Persistent, also look underlying factors for inflation. So and prudent, you know, looking at the underlying causes. On fiscal policy, okay, I'm sorry that fiscal policy is the 3T of Larry Summers, timely targeted. Then on the temporary, there is the question mark afterwards. There was no question mark on Summers before secular stagnation, and some latest Summers view, maybe others here in the room also, I think they will put a question mark or delete the temporary altogether. I think one can discuss that, at least in terms of investment, in particular quality investment, for instance, to ease the environmental transition. I think the argument for not being only a temporary use for stabilization purposes of fiscal policy, I think is very strong. So Draghi, the 3 Ps, the 3 Ts of Summers, and then on the structural reform, the 3 S of myself. So here you have structural reforms, I think feasible, so not looking for the moon, but doing something, but in a very effective way. I think forward-looking, I mentioned the environment here, that is one thing that I think should be taken into account, and fair, incorporating the structural reforms, I mean, moving to structural reform 2.0, not only blood and tears, but also being fair from the social viewpoint. I finished. If you read it counterclockwise, you get TFP, which I think for Europe is a good acronym. Thank you.
Marco, thanks very much. That was terrific. I think particularly the Euro aficionados in our audience, but I hope everyone recognizes how much analytical thought, how much self-analysis and reflection for the Commission and for his colleagues on this experience, and how much distillation of wisdom was contained in his remarks. I commend you. As usual, I'm going to try to ask a few questions before opening it up to our colleagues. First off, again, I think I love your feasible, forward-looking, and fair. I think that's got legs, and I'm hoping that goes forward. And I think most of us would agree with most of your lessons. But I am struck by, say, your slide 6, the one on Deauville. As you said, it got a little lost on that slide. In that slide, we were talking about 500 basis point rises in interest rates for Spain. I know you weren't glossing this over. I just want to make sure this doesn't get lost. This was a very big deal. And in May, June 2010, you have the overdoing of austerity. I remember corresponding with Olivier at the fund while I was at Bank of England and trying to run various efforts to try to stop the UK from overdoing that, which of course were completely failed. And then in the chart on Mario's speech, it showed that it was nearly 2 years in between sort of the crisis moment and Jackson Hole. So I guess what I'm getting at is the lessons seem so clear, but despite the fact that we're always taught the European project proceeds through crisis, there doesn't seem to have been much learning from the political policymakers. So first, just a factual question. Do you think that some of them now get it? That some of the lessons you've distilled now are in people's heads? Like you don't want to do premature austerity, like you have to benefit structural reform. But secondly, if not, what's the path forward for either people like the Peterson Institute or for the Commission if the politicians just never listen? Do we have a duty to keep saying it till we're blue in the face? How do you view this? Sorry for the very long lead up.
Do people get it? The answer is not fully.
Yeah.
I think it is well acknowledged that you, on the policy side, you cannot leave everything on the shoulders of the ECB. However, there has been a pretty furious reactions to a pretty minimal proposal by the Commission on an investment protection capacity via loans, by the way, not even not raising the spectrum of transfer union, where we try to have at least an embryo of central fiscal capacity. But there are certain words like stabilization, which in a number of countries still, go down pretty badly. So at the same time, I think that, for instance, the acknowledgement that you have countries with fiscal space should use it, I think it has become part of the discourse. I think one element which is important here is that we have a system of rules which is of proscribing nature and not of the prescribing nature. So it is in the Maastricht Treaty, in the Stability and Growth Pact, you can say, okay, no to, obviously they can violate it, then we have the procedures, etc. But it is the prescribed. So you should not do this. Much more difficult to do it on a prescribing, which is not part of the. So that's why if we would manage to have a central fiscal capacity, that would help a lot, because it would not force countries to do something which is what they consider to be against their own interest or political preferences. I mean, we have tried putting the emphasis on public investment to emphasize the supply side element. Now, the green element, I think so, in order to get more traction, but I think there is an issue here still of a certain refusal of this. Now, I think we have come to the frontier of what is politically unavoidable. And I mentioned before the fact that you need to have a certain amount of risk sharing in a currency union, which is either by the balance sheet of the ECB or via the balance sheet of governments. In the past, at the beginning of the crisis, in the midst of the crisis, I think even with at the time of whatever it takes, was in a sense one could do the part of risk sharing by the balance sheet of the ECB in a sense more by stealth. Easier in a sense to accept. It's all these purchases of assets and things is more intransparent for the general communication. Now it is clear. You look at the debate in Germany, in Netherlands, in other countries. I think you have to stare at things in a more explicit way. You cannot do it by stealth anymore. So the issue here would have to be, I think, tackled in a very direct way. Now, the other point on Mario Draghi's speech, I think it was the first time that the ECB came to age. If you go back to the very beginning of the ECB, there was a very heated debate inside the bank at the time between Tommaso Padoa-Schioppa and Otmar Issing. Otmar Issing saw the dispersion of governments in front of the ECB as an element of strength for the ECB. You are facing a dispersed power there, so in a sense you can much more easily resist pressure to do something because they are not aligned, those in front of you. Tommaso Padoa-Schioppa had the opposite view. He viewed the ECB potential lowliness, not shielded by coordinated response by governments, as an element of political weakness. Issing won at the time. I think Padoa-Schioppa won eventually.
Fascinating. I was going to ask something else, but picking up on that distinction you made, you mentioned by the by in a bracket about what would have the world been like if your counterparties in the U.S. were not Tim Geithner, Lael Brainerd, without getting too much into individual personalities, not people committed to positive sum multilateral thinking. We are now in a situation where it seems the US government is not of that mindset, at least several of their appointees are not. There are a number of other governments, including in non-Euro area Europe, who are not of that mindset. How do you see the challenges going forward for Europe in that kind of environment? Is it simply in crisis you're worried about it, or are there other ways in which this lesser atmosphere of cooperation do you think is important?
Look, I think Europe has profited a lot from being shielded by the US. I'm not talking only about the security military issue. That obviously is the first order, but also second order, also in economic affairs, very much in the shadow of the US. And this has been, we have been affected by small country syndrome. And what I've sometimes called a reverse creditor paradox. So we thought that having a large surplus in the current account will make us strong. In fact, it's the opposite, because we are much more vulnerable, to shocks and decisions on, for instance, on trade, and we see it now. Let's hope not to see it tomorrow when there is decision on tariffs on cars, but that is so. We'll have to overcome this. So, in a sense, if you put it in a positive way, I think there is increasing awareness that Europe will have to take its destiny in its hands, also on these matters here. the fact that Ursula von der Leyen, the new president of the Commission, has emphasized the geopolitical relevance of European integration, moves lately on here also, breaking new grounds on promoting the international role of the Euro for strategic reasons, I think gives us some element of hope if there is the awareness and the political, realization that one has to indeed do the necessary for punching at our weight in the international arena. One consideration is that I can see it within the G20, there is a very, very strong demand of more Europe. And here it's not only India.
More Europe meaning?
More Europe means Europe being more assertive and taking more leadership.
Okay.
Not only countries, emerging economies, but take countries like Australia, where if they would be in a world which is not even G2, which is 1+1, would be squeezed, sandwiched between China and the US. So there is actually a demand for Europe, which has the critical mass to make the difference, to punch at its own weight. So I think there is an opportunity there. I hope there is enough awareness to do the necessary. But here again, and this is an element which we try to tell countries on the more skeptical side on the EMU and on the policy mix, my last two slides, there is a clear link between the domestic and the external agenda. You do not boost the role of the euro via gadgets. It is only if you pursue and finalize EMU, so including eventually a safe asset, which is the equivalent of the treasury bonds here in the US. Only if you do that and you have a policy mix which makes you more robust, less vulnerable to external developments, that you can boost your credential outside. So this link between the external agenda and the domestic one, I think it has not filtered through fully in the political reasoning.
That's really interesting. Again, to be a little parochial, as Marco mentioned, we at Peterson published books on the euro at 5 and the euro at 10, looking at the global role, and that was a large part our conclusion that there had to be a greater domestic within the euro area combination along the lines you're saying to have the global role. But let me ask one last question before opening up to our audience. One of the, I don't know where to call it, irony, one of the outcomes of the euro crisis and then Brexit is that we've seen in polling data that very large majorities, including in Southern Europe, about wanting to remain in Europe, wanting to remain in the euro area. And yet that doesn't seem to translate into the leadership, the political leadership in these countries taking these next steps towards integration. You've mentioned a couple points at which President Juncker, former Commissioner Almunia, showed political leadership. Without asking you to in any way speculate directly on the new commission, just what do you think can narrow that gap? That there is very positive feeling and commitment to Europe actually among a large range of the population, but that the nation state leaders don't seem to want to go further on integration.
I think what we just discussed before, I mean, the geopolitical relevance, I think must be a factor to make substantive progress on what still needs to be done. And what needs to be done is not difficult. Is the basically things that I was trying to argue before. I mean, there is some movements there. For instance, on banking union, the proposals. You have seen the FT article by Minister Scholz. One can discuss the details, obviously, and more opening shot for negotiations. But the fact that accepts that banking union must eventually have a common deposit guarantee, I think is an important acknowledgement. And second, the way he puts it, the justification, which also links it to the international arena and role of Europe, I think it's an important element. So it's a small step in that direction there. My only hope is that, and this is a bit what we try to do in Brussels, again, making many mistakes, not obviously getting it right, but my job has been try to reduce the discount rate of governments. So that is to take a little bit more of a longer time perspective. And now if you look at the elections and including the very latest ones on the pressure on the populist side, especially populist on the right, makes it very difficult to lengthen the time horizon of governance. I would hope that that takes place, and there is a bit more breathing and to incorporate all these considerations. And I think again, the external dimension is important. I mean, Europe tends to be in the common narrative not to be particularly popular. But if you take Eurobarometer, you mentioned yourself those. The popularity of the Europe, is going up at the 3/4 of support, and even populists of the harsh side, do not dare really to envisage an exit from the Eurozone. I think here, if you look at between the two rounds of the French elections, what made the difference, one element that made the difference between Le Pen and Macron was that at the end of the day, French citizens and savers were not trusting that had Le Pen come in, they would be safe on that front. So that in the sense helped to tilt the balance in favor of Emmanuel Macron. So I would hope that this external element plus this natural attitude would give sufficient courage to make objectively difficult choices, but not relying again on the ultima ratio of making difficult choices only when you have shoulder against the wall.
Thank you. Let me open it up to our audience. This is all on the record. It's being web streamed live. Jessica has a traveling mic up front. There's a standing mic at back. I see two Peterson people. If there's anyone who's not Peterson staff who would like to have the first question, please. Please identify yourself when speaking.
Thank you. This is Lorenzo Giorgiani from Tudor. I didn't mean to interject and be the first one.
It's to be preferred. Thank you.
So China is running a deficit of about north of 10% if you include the quasi spending that they do outside of the official statistics. The US is flirting with 5% of GDP deficit. I guess the Eurozone is about maybe 1%. Does it seem like it's a missed opportunity to have a reserve currency and not try in a moment of a difficult economic, you're in a cyclical position where clearly you could benefit from additional fiscal boost? Isn't it a missed opportunity? And do you expect the deficit to be widened under what conditions? That is, what do we need to see a deepening of the downturn before European institutions and policymakers react?
No, we let him. Okay. You can be as brief as you like.
I think the opportunity of very low, even negative interest rates has to be seized. I think difficult to believe that there will not be public investment projects with a social return higher than the current interest rate. So that is seems to be evident. At the same time, and I think here, what I have said before, it was very much on a purely personal basis. Now I can put a bit also the hat of Commission officials still in charge of economic and financial affairs. A hat, not the helmet. And then, what we are telling countries is that differentiation of fiscal positions and sustainability, let's say, risks have to be taken into account on this. So I think what we call countries to do is those with fiscal space actually to use it for that, whilst for countries with still very high level of debt, we called not to embark again in a new round of austerity measures, but keep prudent. Because, I mean, things are, they are not safe forever. And I mean, the episode of last year with the Italian government shows that the zero lower bound does not apply to individual governments individually taken. I mean, they are borrowing, in a sense, in a common currency, which is also for each one individually a foreign currency. And if you do not transmit a sense of being cautious and take into account sustainability concerns, you have interest rates, going up, and Italy for a long time, I think still now, actually has a positive interest rate growth rate differential. So in spite of the very low interest rate in general, I think if there are doubts on the sustainability on the one hand, and so-called risks of redenomination, then you can quickly get into trouble. So the message here is a bit articulated one on taking into account the differentiation of countries' position, a lot of emphasis on the quality of public finances, and here the green element is important, while making sure not everything becomes it has not everything should have a chromatic mutation. So that everything becomes green for opportunistic reasons, and having a central fiscal capacity, I think, which would help in a sense to lessen the constraints there.
Thank you. If those of you towards the rear could come to the back mic, we'll recognize you in turn. Then, so Jacob, then John, then the next at the back mic.
Jacob Kierkegaard from the Peterson Institute. I mean, you mentioned the sort of downsides of the sort of ultima ratio way of the EU has acted only under severe crisis. But I suppose there's one crisis that has been going on now for a number of years that threatens to be, if not permanent, then at least last for a very long time, and that's Brexit. And you mentioned Minister Scholz. I mean, he very explicitly in his op-ed said that part of the reason why he was making these proposals was, I mean, you phrased it as the international set of circumstances, but he mentioned Brexit explicitly, which would suggest that this development at least might have a positive impact on one of your four forward-looking policy areas, or the forward-looking policy agenda. So, I mean, just as someone who's been in the belly of the beast for so many years, how do you think the impact of Brexit will affect the other three of your policy areas, especially one that is a type of Brexit that Prime Minister Johnson seems to be envisioning?
I have to be reticent on in the answer. No, I have not been so far, but no. But on this, I want to be very prudent. I think again, to a certain extent, what is happening in the world arena with a not very multilaterally prone U.S. administration prompting advancements in European integration, the same type of reasoning may apply also on the Brexit side. I think the impact there on my last two slides, I think is potentially powerful, provided that there is an outburst of awareness on this, and taking into account that this is indeed, as you indicate, is a shock that is going to be more of a permanent one. I think it provides quite a bit of rationale with different channels, more directly and indirectly, for actually all the four elements. But I would say also my final slides on the policy mix the policy mix. I think there, changes on all fronts of the fiscal, in a sense, the monetary regulatory side, also financial, but also on the social side are potentially, I think, very encompassing. So yes, I'm not saying more than this because actually we don't know what is going to happen, and I don't want to speculate at all on the type of scenarios that we are going to face maybe in only a few weeks.
I think, yeah. No, we're grateful for that level of frankness. Jean here, and then the gentleman at the back.
Thank you, Jean Pisani. I'm visiting the Peterson Institute. Listening to your recollection, your analysis, I was hesitating between two interpretations. One is that strikingly, through all the episodes, you alluded to the German position and said it was wrong and dangerous. So it's a battle of ideas. Germany had it wrong. We survived. But the question is, has Germany learned a lesson? Have the views changed or not? And there are some elements that go in this direction, like Mr. Scholz's plan, but other elements, the attitude vis-à-vis the ECB, that do not go in this direction. The other interpretation is that it's not a problem of different doctrines, different models. It's more a problem of institution or more a political problem. You spend an enormous amount of time in committees. You've witnessed that sensible people sitting in committees can take very wrong decisions because there's a failure to internalize the spillovers. They all speak for their constituency and with a very narrow view of things, and therefore that the solution is mostly institutional. I would like you to sort of go back and tell us what you think of those two interpretations and what would be your preferred narrative.
I think on the German side, I think what we have tried to do is both for Germany on the one hand and for other countries being more on the southern side, I mean, is to at the end of the day to try to present a package which is more which is balanced. I mean, I indicated before, I put the emphasis on risk sharing versus risk aversion, risk sharing versus risk reduction. So the solidarity versus the responsibility side. And I mentioned before what we tell the Germans of this world on the risk reduction. Be careful, because if you put all the emphasis there on the risk reduction without having the risk sharing side, be it common deposit guarantee, central fiscal capacity, eventually also a safe asset, you try to do things and you may have a repetition of Deauville, which eventually increases the lending and the bailout instead of the bail-in. At the same time, we tell also countries, Italy, France, and others, that the political capital for risk sharing and solidarity is essentially limited. So you cannot hope that this is extensible in an endless way, and choices will have to be made in order to make sure that, in a sense, you deserve the solidarity element there. There is one thing which I think has affected the management of the crisis of the past several years, is that reforms have not been done under the veil of ignorance. I mean, from Raoul's, you would, when you make reforms, you do changes, you want to operate under the veil of ignorance. The veil of ignorance means that ex ante, you do not know who is going to profit of being, and also maybe in ERT is one, in ERT plus one, maybe another one. During the crisis, this veil of ignorance is broken. So we do reforms in a way in which the elements of who gains and who loses is very immediate and very visible. To be fair and to be historically honest, this has often been the case.
Yeah.
Go back to Bretton Woods, Harry Dexter White, and Maynard Keynes. We knew there who were the creditors and the debtors, and Maynard Keynes had the banker and a very strong economic rationale for his ideas and proposals, and Harry Dexter White won. So that is often the case here, but this was particularly relevant in the case of the Eurozone crisis. One thing that I think is important to emphasize is that, and here hopefully there is some awareness on especially on, let's say, creditors' side, is that the creditors of today are not necessarily the creditors of tomorrow. I think I repeat myself. I've said it already in the past. And we had a preview of this back in 2015 on the immigration crisis, not a directly economic issue, when there was the pouring of 1 million plus of immigrants in Germany. There, the request of solidarity came from Germany, actually. And if one thinks about what is happening here on this side of the Atlantic, on the trade side, tariffs and trade restrictions, I'm easy to predict that the creditors of today, from that viewpoint, are definitely most likely not the creditors of tomorrow. So recreating this veil of ignorance actually would hopefully would help to make progress on both my final slides.
That's a very profound insight. The last question, please. No, you. The one who's standing.
Mark Sobel, Fifth. First of all, I wanted to praise you for your many years of service in ECFIN and being a good collaborator. And a simple question. So there's the SGP, there's the 2-pack, the 6-pack, the multilateral imbalance procedure, and then there's national rules like debt breaks and Schwarz-Null and all that. So there's been a commentary that the rules are too complicated for people to understand. And I was wondering if the new commission is going to be looking at this subject and what personal thoughts you have on this matter, having overseen it for a bit of time.
Okay, thank you, Mark. Actually, Mark was for many of these years, our counterparts here, resurrecting every time there was a change of administration. So we worked very closely in the past G20, G7, etc. So nice to see you here also. Okay, first on changes of the rules. We have a legal obligation to present a review of the reforms of the fiscal and macroeconomic surveillance rules which were adopted during the crisis. And this has to be done by the end of the year or beginning of next year. So it's going to be an ex post assessment of how rules have functioned and some orientations for the future. Whether that will lead to legislative changes or regulatory changes or not, it depends. I mean, we will have to see. And our intention at the moment, without pre-committing the new College of Commissioners, is to have actually, and here would be something that I would hope that Peterson would help, to have a wide and genuine consultation, to have more ownership. I don't want to have any more a situation in which the Commission is battered from the two sides. Those who think we are more tough, we are too tough, others who think we are too lenient. At least there should be some common ownership of the rules, whether we decide to go for explicit changes in the legislative process, which is complicated because at the end of the day, at least in part of this reform, you need unanimity of the member states, or whether we proceed more by interpretation. But my final consideration is on your point on complexity. And in the debate here, there is a stress on, and I think a right one, on excessive complexity, intransparency of the rules, so the difficult to communicate. And often in the discussions, this complexity is seen as one of the reasons why rules are not effective. Now, in reality, complexity is not the cause, is the effect. The cause really is the lack of trust between member states and between member states and institutions. So when you do not have trust in someone you are dealing with, and you want to buy a car, and what do? You try to write the complete contract. So what you do is try to spell out all the state of the worlds in which you, so you can feel safe or reasonably safe in buying the car. So you write down the attempt is to write the complete contract. We know as economists, complete contracts cannot be written because you have always states of the world which cannot be predicted or anticipated in advance. So the result of that is that every time there has been something proposed which would inevitably require a certain degree of interpretation and judgment, the attempt has been to codify it in a very algorithmic way with all the complications. So what happens is that all the vademecum, the implementation acts, rule book, etc., has led to a piling up of several kilos of documents, which has made the rules extremely intransparent and very complex. But the point here is that we have to find a way to recreate the trust and avoid moving away from the temptation to write the complete contract, rather than dealing only with the complexity directly if you do not, because that would be tackling trying to make sure that the thermometer works better, but the fever is not going to go away if trust is not recreated.
That's the kind of basic insight that I think we should end on. Again, echoing our last question, I want to thank Marco Buti for his career of public service, not only to the Euro area, not only to the European Union, but to the global economic community. I want to thank him for such analytically and thoughtfully forthright remarks as were given here today, which I hope everyone will distribute and think about. And I want to wish you continued success and influence in the years to come, which I know you will exert with the same good spirit and the same analytical bent. Thank you very much.
Thank you.